Imagine waking up one morning and deciding to leave everything behind. Your home, your family's land, the graves of your ancestors. You pack a single suitcase, maybe two, and you board a train heading north. You don't know if you'll ever come back. You don't know what awaits you. But you know one thing with absolute certainty. Staying means suffocating under a system designed to keep you in chains, even though slavery officially ended decades ago. Now imagine this wasn't just one person's story. It was 6 million people. 6 million Americans who made this impossible choice between 1916 and 1970. They left the cotton fields of Mississippi, the tobacco farms of North Carolina, the segregated streets of Alabama, and they headed north and west to Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. This mass movement of people didn't happen because of war, at least not directly. It didn't happen because of famine. It happened because the entire population said enough to a system of racial oppression so brutal, so dehumanizing, that risking everything in an unknown city felt like the better option than staying home. This is the story of the Great Migration. And if you think this is ancient history, something that has nothing to do with your life today, I'm going to show you why you're wrong. The America you live in right now, the cities you know, the music you listen to, the very fabric of modern American culture, was fundamentally shaped by this movement, and we barely talk about it. Let's change that. To understand why 6 million people left their homes, you need to understand what the American South was like for Black Americans between 1916 and 1970. And I need to be blunt here. It was a nightmare designed by law. When slavery ended in 1865, there was a brief moment of hope. Reconstruction promised change. Black men voted. Some were elected to Congress. Black communities built schools and businesses. But that moment was short-lived. By the 1890s, white Southern politicians had systematically stripped away these rights through a combination of violence, intimidation, and legislation we now call Jim Crow laws. These weren't just separate but equal facilities, though that phrase itself was a lie. These laws touched every aspect of life: where you could sit on a bus, which water fountain you could drink from, which door you could enter a building through, where you could be buried when you died. And the facilities weren't equal, not even close. Black schools received a fraction of the funding white schools got. Black hospitals were overcrowded and understaffed. Black neighborhoods had unpaved roads while white neighborhoods were maintained. But Jim Crow wasn't just about separate facilities. It was about control. It was about keeping Black Americans in a subordinate position economically and socially. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the economic system that trapped millions. After the Civil War, most formerly enslaved people had nothing. No land, no money, no resources. Landowners, who still controlled the vast plantations, needed labor. The solution was sharecropping, a system that sounds fair on paper but was exploitation in practice. Here's how it worked. A Black family would work a plot of land owned by a white landowner. They'd plant cotton or tobacco, tend it through the season, harvest it. In theory, they'd get a share of the profits after the harvest. In reality, the landowner controlled everything. The landowner provided seeds, tools, and supplies on credit. The landowner kept the books. The landowner set the prices. The landowner decided what share the family got. At the end of the season, sharecroppers would be told they owed money. The debt was always more than the harvest was worth. And if you were in debt, you couldn't leave. Leaving while in debt was a crime in many southern states. So families worked year after year, generation after generation, and never got ahead. They were trapped by debt the same way their ancestors had been trapped by chains. Some historians call this slavery by another name, and they're not exaggerating. In some cases, black men were arrested on trumped-up charges, convicted in rigged courts, and leased out to work in mines, turpentine camps, or on chain gangs. This convict leasing system was explicitly designed to recreate slavery, and it killed thousands. But economic oppression was only part of the story. The other part was violence, systematic and terrifying. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,400 black Americans were lynched in the South. Lynched. That's not a euphemism. We're talking about people being dragged from their homes, tortured, hanged from trees, sometimes burned alive, often in front of crowds of white spectators who treated it like entertainment. Photographs were taken, postcards were made and mailed. And these weren't isolated incidents by rogue individuals. These were community events, often with the participation or complicity of local law enforcement. The message was clear: step out of line, challenge the racial order in any way, and this could happen to you. And stepping out of line could mean almost anything. Looking at a white woman, talking back to a white man, being too successful in business, trying to vote. The constant threat of violence hung over every aspect of life. Parents had to teach their children the unwritten rules of survival. Never make eye contact with white people. Always step off the sidewalk when they approach. Never question. Never challenge. Make yourself small and invisible. This was the psychological terrorism that accompanied the legal and economic oppression. So why did the Great Migration start around 1916? Black Americans had been living under these conditions for decades. What changed? Three major factors converged to create the perfect storm for mass migration. First, World War I. When the war broke out in Europe in 1914, immigration from Europe to America slowed to a trickle. Northern factories that had relied on European immigrant labor suddenly faced a labor shortage. At the same time, these factories were ramping up production to support the war effort. They needed workers desperately. For the first time, Northern employers began actively recruiting black workers from the South. Labor agents traveled through Southern towns, offering train tickets and the promise of jobs. They posted advertisements in black newspapers describing opportunities in Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh for sharecroppers trapped in debt. This was a lifeline. Second, the boll weevil. Starting around 1915, a beetle called the boll weevil devastated cotton crops across the South. This pest destroyed entire harvests, wiping out the economic foundation of the sharecropping system. Landowners couldn't pay workers. Sharecroppers couldn't pay debts. The already fragile economy collapsed in many areas. People were starving. Migration became not just attractive, but necessary for survival. Third, information networks. This is crucial and often overlooked. The Great Migration wasn't just individuals making random decisions. It was facilitated by newspapers, letters, and word of mouth. The Chicago Defender, one of the most prominent black newspapers, actively encouraged migration. It published stories about opportunities in the North, about black people who had moved and succeeded. It reported on Southern violence and injustice. Copies were smuggled into the Deep South and passed from hand to hand. And then there were letters. People who had migrated north wrote back to family and friends. They described real wages, paid in cash. They described cities where you could walk down any street, where your children could go to better schools, where you didn't have to step off the sidewalk for anyone. These letters were read aloud in churches, shared in communities. They created what scholars call migration chains, networks of information and support that made the journey less daunting. By 1916, all these factors came together. The pressure cooker that was the Jim Crow South was at maximum pressure, and the release valve was a train ticket north. The decision to leave wasn't made lightly. This wasn't a vacation. This was leaving behind everything you'd ever known, possibly forever. For many, it meant leaving family members who were too old or too afraid to make the journey. It meant abandoning the land your family had worked for generations, even if you didn't own it. It meant saying goodbye to your church, your community, the graves of your ancestors. Here's something most people don't realize. Many migrants had to leave in secret. Remember, if you were a sharecropper in debt, leaving was illegal. Landowners who found out you were planning to leave could have you arrested. They could use violence or threats to keep you in place. Labor agents who recruited black workers were run out of towns, sometimes beaten or killed. So people planned in hushed conversations. They packed in secret. They left in the middle of the night. One person would leave first, get established, and then send for family members one or two at a time. Fathers left wives and children behind, promising to send for them once they had work and a place to live. Sometimes it took months or years to reunite families. There are heartbreaking stories of goodbyes. Children saying goodbye to grandparents, knowing they might never see them again. Couples separated, hoping the promise of a better life would be worth the pain of separation. Communities fracturing as the young and able-bodied left, and the elderly and infirm stayed behind. For most migrants, the journey north was by train. They traveled in the segregated colored cars, which were usually older, more crowded, and positioned closer to the coal-burning engine where smoke and soot filled the air. The journey from Mississippi to Chicago took about 24 hours. From Alabama to Detroit, about 20 hours. But it wasn't the length that was most challenging. It was crossing the invisible line. Somewhere along that train route, usually around the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line, the rules changed. The colored car was no longer mandatory. You could sit where you wanted, use any bathroom. Some migrants described this moment as almost spiritual, the moment they realized they'd crossed into a different world. One migrant, a man named Richard Wright, who would later become a famous author, described the feeling this way. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant an alien soil to see if it could grow differently. But the journey was also dangerous. White Southerners, who saw groups of black people traveling north, especially families with luggage, knew what was happening. There are accounts of migrants being pulled off trains, beaten, robbed. Some never made it to their destination. Imagine stepping off the train in Chicago's Union Station or New York's Penn Station. If you're from rural Mississippi, you've probably never seen a building more than 2 stories tall. Now you're surrounded by skyscrapers, cars, crowds of people moving with purpose. The noise is overwhelming. The smell is different. Coal smoke, exhaust, food from a dozen different cultures. Some migrants had family or friends waiting for them, people who had made the journey earlier and could show them the ropes. These early arrivals were lifelines, helping newcomers find housing, navigate the city, locate job opportunities. But others arrived alone, clutching addresses, scribbled on pieces of paper, hoping they'd lead to boarding houses or churches that helped new arrivals. And then there was the cold. If you arrived in winter, and many did, the northern cold was shocking. Mississippi winters are mild. Chicago winters are brutal. Stories abound of migrants arriving in thin cotton clothes, totally unprepared for temperatures that dropped below zero. But despite the disorientation and challenges, many migrants describe their first days in the North with a sense of awe and possibility. Here's what they noticed immediately. No white and colored signs. No one forced them to step off the sidewalk. They could walk into stores through the front door. Their children could go to schools that had new textbooks and functioning bathrooms. These basic dignities, things white Americans took for granted, felt revolutionary. One migrant woman from Georgia described her first day in Philadelphia like this. "I went downtown and I saw a water fountain. Just a water fountain, no sign above it. I stood there for 10 minutes just looking at it before I drank. I kept waiting for someone to yell at me. No one did." The promise of work drew migrants north, but the reality was more complicated than the recruitment posters suggested. Yes, there were jobs, but they were usually the jobs white workers didn't want. In the meatpacking plants of Chicago, black workers were assigned the most dangerous positions, like the kill floor where animals were slaughtered. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh, they worked the hottest, most grueling jobs in the blast furnaces. In Detroit's auto factories, they were janitors and assembly line workers, but rarely foremen or managers. The wages were still better than anything they could earn in the South. A black worker in a Chicago stockyard might earn $5 a day, which was more than many sharecroppers made in a month. But the cost of living in the North was also higher. Rent, food, clothing for cold weather, it all added up. Many families needed multiple wage earners to make ends meet. There was also the issue of job security. Black workers were often the last hired and the first fired. During economic downturns, they lost their jobs before white workers, and unions, which could have provided protection and advocacy, were often hostile to black workers. Many unions explicitly excluded black members or relegated them to separate, less powerful locals. Despite these obstacles, migrants found work and began building lives. They saved money. They sent for family members still in the South. They started to dream about futures beyond mere survival. One of the most important things migrants did was create community. They needed it. Northern cities could be isolating and hostile. So migrants did what humans have always done. They found each other. Churches became the center of community life. The Great Migration led to an explosion of black churches in northern cities. Storefront churches, Baptist churches, African Methodist Episcopal churches, they popped up in every neighborhood where migrants settled. These churches weren't just places of worship, they were social service centers, job networks, political organizing hubs, and sources of comfort and connection. Neighborhoods became defined by where people came from. In Chicago, certain blocks were known as Little Mississippi or Little Alabama because so many migrants from those states had settled there. In these neighborhoods, you could find restaurants serving Southern food, barbershops that felt like the ones back home, social clubs organized by home state. Newspapers played a crucial role. Publications like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the New York Amsterdam News served as the voice of Black America. They reported on both Southern injustice and Northern opportunities. They covered Black achievement, Black culture, Black politics. They helped migrants stay connected to their roots while navigating their new lives. And then there was the creation of what we'd now call infrastructure. Black doctors opened practices to serve black patients who weren't welcome in white hospitals. Black lawyers set up firms to fight discrimination and injustice. Black entrepreneurs opened businesses, restaurants, stores, insurance companies, funeral homes that served the growing black population in northern cities. This wasn't just survival. This was the building of a parallel society, a black metropolis within the larger city. And from this foundation, something extraordinary would emerge. The Great Migration didn't just change the lives of the people who migrated. It fundamentally transformed American society, economy, politics, and culture. The America that existed before the Great Migration was a very different country from the America that existed after. Let's break down how. Let's start with the most measurable impact: economics. 6 million people moving from one region to another represented a massive shift of labor and economic potential. For the North, this influx of workers fueled industrial growth during critical periods. During World War I, black migrants kept factories running when European immigration stopped. During World War II, they filled jobs left empty by soldiers fighting overseas and powered the arsenal of democracy that built tanks, planes, and ships. Industries that had relied on European immigrant labor were transformed by black workers. The meatpacking industry in Chicago, the steel industry in Pittsburgh, the auto industry in Detroit, all were revolutionized by black labor. By 1930, black workers made up significant percentages of the workforce in these industries. But the economic impact went beyond just providing labor. Black migrants created new markets. They spent wages on housing, food, clothing, and entertainment. This created demand that fueled business growth. And crucially, because they often faced discrimination in white-owned businesses, they created their own businesses. The emergence of black business districts in cities like Harlem in New York, Bronzeville in Chicago, and Paradise Valley in Detroit represented real wealth creation. These weren't just mom-and-pop shops. These were thriving commercial centers with banks, insurance companies, hotels, theaters, and professional services. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, before it was destroyed in the 1921 massacre, showed what was possible. For the South, the economic impact was more ambiguous. In the short term, the loss of labor created crisis. Landowners who had relied on cheap black labor suddenly faced shortages. Some raised wages to keep workers from leaving. Others increased mechanization, especially in cotton production. The cotton picking machine, which became widespread in the 1940s and 1950s, was partly a response to labor shortages created by the Great Migration. In the long term, the South's economy had to modernize. The sharecropping system that had dominated for decades became less viable. This eventually led to a more diverse, industrialized Southern economy, though that transformation took decades and came with its own costs. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Great Migration was political. When black Americans moved north, they moved into states where they could vote. Let that sink in. In Mississippi in 1920, only about 1% of black adults were registered to vote, thanks to poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation. In Chicago, they could register and vote freely. This shift in political power was seismic. By the 1930s and 1940s, black voters in northern cities became a crucial voting bloc that politicians couldn't ignore. In the 1936 presidential election, black voters played a key role in Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory. They helped elect black representatives to Congress from northern districts, something that hadn't happened since Reconstruction. The concentration of black voters in urban areas of swing states gave them disproportionate political influence. Politicians who wanted to win states like Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan had to pay attention to black concerns. This created pressure for civil rights legislation and anti-discrimination policies at the federal level. It also enabled the rise of black political machines and black political leaders. People like William Dawson in Chicago, Adam Clayton Powell in New York, and later figures like Charles Diggs in Detroit became power brokers. They could deliver votes, which gave them leverage. The Great Migration also contributed to the eventual realignment of American politics. For decades after the Civil War, black voters who could vote supported the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But during the Great Depression, many black voters switched to the Democratic Party, attracted by New Deal programs and Roosevelt's rhetoric about economic justice. This shift intensified during the Civil Rights era and fundamentally changed the political map of America. But political power came with backlash. As black populations grew in northern cities, white residents and politicians resisted. This brings us to one of the darkest aspects of the Great Migration's impact. When black migrants arrived in northern cities, they needed places to live. But they quickly discovered that northern freedom had limits. Housing discrimination was pervasive and systematic. Landlords refused to rent to black tenants. Real estate agents wouldn't show houses in white neighborhoods to black buyers. Banks denied mortgages or offered them on predatory terms. And in many cities, homeowners formed neighborhood improvement associations with the explicit goal of keeping black families out. They used restrictive covenants, legal clauses in property deeds that prohibited selling to non-white buyers, to maintain segregation. When these informal methods weren't enough, white residents used violence. When a black family moved into a white neighborhood, their homes were sometimes firebombed. Mobs gathered to intimidate and threaten. Riots erupted in cities across the North, Detroit in 1943, Chicago in 1919, and others, often sparked by housing tensions. The result was residential segregation that was, in many cases, more complete than it had been in the South. Black migrants were forced into overcrowded neighborhoods that white residents were abandoning. These neighborhoods became the urban ghettos we're familiar with today: the South Side of Chicago, Harlem in New York, the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Paradise Valley in Detroit. Landlords knew black tenants had few options, so they charged high rents for substandard housing. Overcrowding was severe. Families doubled up in apartments. Boarding houses were packed. Buildings weren't maintained. In winter, heat was inadequate. Plumbing failed. The federal government made this worse. New Deal housing programs, which provided mortgages and built public housing, were explicitly segregated. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual literally recommended against insuring mortgages in integrated neighborhoods or in neighborhoods with black residents. This practice, called redlining, denied wealth-building opportunities to generations of black families. After World War II, when the federal government subsidized suburban development through programs like the GI Bill, black veterans were systematically excluded. The suburbs that grew up around American cities in the 1950s and 1960s were white by design. Black families remained concentrated in urban cores as white families moved out, taking their tax dollars with them. This created a cycle of disadvantage. Black neighborhoods had less tax revenue, which meant worse schools, worse public services, worse infrastructure. This fueled poverty, which fueled crime, which was used to justify further discrimination. The effects of these policies are still visible today in the racial wealth gap, in educational disparities, in health outcomes. But let me be clear, the Great Migration didn't create these problems. Racism and discrimination created them. The Great Migration just made them visible in northern cities where they had previously been less apparent. Now let's talk about culture, because this is where the Great Migration's impact becomes undeniable and frankly exciting. When migrants came north, they brought their culture with them, their music, their food, their religious traditions, their ways of speaking and storytelling. And in the urban north, these traditions collided with and mixed with other cultures: European immigrant cultures, Caribbean cultures, northern black cultures that had existed before the migration. The result was an explosion of creativity that changed American culture forever. Let's start with music. In the South, Black Americans had developed musical traditions rooted in African heritage, shaped by slavery, work songs, field hollers, spirituals, and blues. When this music came north, it evolved and diversified. Blues became urbanized. The Mississippi Delta blues of Robert Johnson became the Chicago blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, electric, amplified, intense. This music spoke to the migrant experience, the loneliness of the city, the hard work, the longing for home, but also the newfound freedom and possibility. Jazz, which had originated in New Orleans, exploded in northern cities: Chicago, New York, Kansas City. These became jazz capitals. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, many of the most iconic jazz musicians were either migrants or children of migrants. Jazz clubs in Harlem and the South Side became sites of innovation, where musicians pushed boundaries and created new sounds. Gospel music was transformed in northern churches. Migrants brought Southern gospel traditions. But in the large urban churches of the North, gospel became more elaborate, more performance-oriented. Artists like Mahalia Jackson and Thomas Dorsey pioneered a new gospel sound that influenced everything that came after. And then, crucially, these musical traditions gave birth to new genres. Rhythm and blues evolved from blues and gospel in the 1940s and 1950s. Rock and roll emerged from the mixing of R&B with country and other influences, and many of the pioneers, like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, were products of the Great Migration experience. Soul music in the 1960s and 1970s reflected the urban black experience shaped by migration. And later, hip-hop emerged from the streets of New York, influenced by the children and grandchildren of migrants. If you listen to popular music today, any genre, you're hearing echoes of the Great Migration. The musical culture of America was fundamentally created and shaped by this movement of people. The Great Migration fueled artistic creativity beyond music. The concentration of Black Americans in urban centers created audiences for Black art and literature. It created communities where Black artists could support each other and push boundaries. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s was the most famous example. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, and Countee Cullen produced literature that explored Black identity, celebrated Black culture, and critiqued American racism. This wasn't just writing for white audiences. This was Black people writing for themselves, defining themselves on their own terms. This continued in subsequent decades. Richard Wright's Native Son and Black Boy drew directly from the migrant experience. James Baldwin, who grew up in Harlem as the son and stepson of migrants, became one of the 20th century's most important writers. Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun told the story of a Black family on Chicago's South Side navigating housing discrimination. Visual artists like Jacob Lawrence documented the migration itself. His Migration series, 60 panels depicting the movement of Black Americans from South to North, is one of the most important works of 20th century American art. Even sports were transformed. The Great Migration coincided with and contributed to the integration of professional sports. Jackie Robinson, who broke baseball's color barrier in 1947, was born in Georgia but grew up in California after his family migrated. Many of the black athletes who integrated professional baseball, football, and basketball in the 1940s and 1950s were migrants or children of migrants. Sports became a space where Black Americans could demonstrate excellence and demand respect. And because sports were so visible and so important to American culture, Black athletic achievement helped shift public opinion on race. So we've talked about what happened, who it happened to, and what the immediate impacts were. Now I want to talk about why this matters today. Why should you care about something that happened between 1916 and 1970? Because the Great Migration's effects are all around you, whether you realize it or not. Look at a map of where Black Americans live today. The distribution is radically different from what it was in 1900. In 1900, about 90% of Black Americans lived in the South, mostly in rural areas. Today, the Black population is more evenly distributed across regions, with major concentrations in urban areas throughout the country. The cities we think of as having significant Black populations, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, became that way because of the Great Migration. The neighborhoods within those cities that are historically Black exist because of the Great Migration and the segregation that followed it. And this demographic shift has political implications that persist. The concentration of Black voters in urban areas of swing states continues to be politically significant. Elections are won and lost based on turnout in cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee, cities shaped by the Great Migration. Remember how I talked about the creation of urban ghettos? That didn't go away. In fact, in some ways, it got worse. The segregation created during the Great Migration era was reinforced by decades of discriminatory policies and practices. Even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made housing discrimination illegal, segregation persisted through more subtle mechanisms. White flight continued. Predatory lending targeted Black neighborhoods. Discriminatory policing and mass incarceration destabilized Black communities. Gentrification has recently displaced long-time Black residents from neighborhoods their families had lived in for generations. Many of the most segregated cities in America today, Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, are cities that received large numbers of Black migrants and then systematically segregated them. The racial wealth gap, educational achievement gaps, health disparities, all of these have roots in the housing discrimination and economic exclusion that migrants and their descendants faced. But the legacy isn't all negative. Let's talk about culture again, because this is crucial. American culture, the culture that dominates globally, is disproportionately influenced by Black American culture. And Black American culture was profoundly shaped by the Great Migration. Think about it. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, disco, hip-hop, R&B. These genres, which originated in or were shaped by Black communities, are the foundation of modern popular music worldwide. When someone in Tokyo or London or Sao Paulo listens to music, they're often listening to musical forms created by Black Americans, many of whom were products of the Great Migration experience. Fashion, language, dance, food. Black cultural innovations have been adopted and adapted by mainstream American culture and then exported globally. The foods we think of as soul food, fried chicken, collard greens, sweet potato pie, came north with the migrants and became iconic American dishes. This cultural influence is enormous and often under-acknowledged. The Great Migration didn't just move people, it moved culture, and that culture became American culture. The Great Migration also offers lessons about migration itself, lessons that are relevant today when migration is one of the most contentious political issues in the world. First, people migrate when staying becomes impossible. The Great Migration wasn't a whim. It was a response to oppression, economic desperation, and violence. Today, when we see migration from Central America, from Syria, from sub-Saharan Africa, we should remember that people don't leave their homes lightly. They leave when staying means suffering or death. Second, migrants face hostility in their new homes, even when those new homes need their labor. Black migrants were recruited to northern cities, but once they arrived, they faced discrimination and violence. This pattern repeats throughout history. Migrants are wanted for their labor, but resented for their presence. Third, migrants enrich their new communities culturally and economically, even when those communities don't initially welcome them. The cultural flowering that emerged from the Great Migration benefited all of America, not just Black Americans. The economic contributions of migrants helped build the industrial base that made America a superpower. Fourth, the effects of migration last for generations. We're still living with the consequences of the Great Migration, both positive and negative. Policy decisions made in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s about housing, education, and employment still shape American life today. Here's something interesting. The Great Migration isn't the end of the story. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating in the 1990s and 2000s, Black Americans began moving back to the South. Demographers call this the reverse migration, or New Great Migration. Why? Several reasons. The South changed. Jim Crow ended. The South's economy grew and diversified, creating opportunities. Meanwhile, northern cities experienced deindustrialization, with the loss of manufacturing jobs that had drawn migrants in the first place. Cities like Detroit and Cleveland, which had boomed during the migration, fell into decline. Many Black Americans, especially middle-class professionals, found better opportunities in growing southern cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, Houston, and Dallas. Others sought to reconnect with family roots, to retire in the region their grandparents had fled. This reverse migration is itself a fascinating chapter in American history, showing how migration patterns respond to changing economic and social conditions. But it's important to note that the people moving south today are often moving into very different circumstances than their grandparents left. They're moving to cities, not rural areas. They're professionals and retirees, not sharecroppers. Still, the symmetry is striking. A great movement north, then a movement back south. American history as a story of people in motion, always seeking better opportunities, always trying to find a place where they can thrive. But let's be honest, many of the problems the Great Migration exposed remain unresolved. Racial inequality in wealth, education, health, and justice persists. The neighborhoods where migrants settled are still, in many cases, segregated and under-resourced. The promise of the North, that migration would lead to equality, was only partially fulfilled. The civil rights movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, was partly a product of the Great Migration. The concentration of Black Americans in northern cities gave them political power. The contrast between southern and northern conditions made national action necessary. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., though from the South, built coalitions that included northern black communities shaped by the migration. But even the victories of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, didn't completely eliminate the disparities created and reinforced during the migration era. Structural racism proved more resilient than laws alone could address. So the Great Migration's legacy is complex. It was an act of courage and self-determination by millions of people who refused to accept oppression. It transformed American society and culture in profound and lasting ways. But it also revealed the depths of American racism and the difficulty of achieving true equality. So let's bring this back to where we started. 6 million people. One of the largest internal migrations in human history. A movement that reshaped American cities, transformed American culture, and changed the course of American politics. And yet, how many people learn about this in school? How many Americans, when asked about major events in 20th century American history, would even mention the Great Migration? It's not taught with the same emphasis as World War I or World War II, even though it happened during both and was connected to both. It's not as famous as the Civil Rights Movement, even though it made that movement possible. Why? I think part of it is that the Great Migration doesn't fit neatly into the story America likes to tell about itself. It's not a story of American benevolence or heroism. It's a story of Americans fleeing American oppression. It's a story that exposes the lie of separate but equal and shows that racism wasn't just a Southern problem. It was a national problem that manifested differently in different regions but was pervasive everywhere. But it's also a story of incredible human resilience. Think about what it took for a sharecropper in Mississippi to decide to pack up and leave for Chicago. Think about the courage, the hope, the determination. These weren't passive victims of history. These were people who took control of their own destinies, even when doing so was terrifying and risky. And think about what they built. They built communities. They built churches and businesses and cultural institutions. They raised children who became artists, activists, politicians, scholars, athletes. They created music and literature that defined American culture for the entire world. The Great Migration is a story about what happens when people refuse to accept the circumstances they're born into. It's about the human drive for dignity and opportunity. It's about how ordinary people making individual decisions can collectively change the course of history. If you're Black American with family that's been in this country for generations, there's a good chance your family story includes the Great Migration. Your grandparents or great-grandparents might have made that journey. The city you grew up in, the neighborhood you lived in, the church your family attended, all of that might trace back to decisions made by people who boarded trains heading north decades ago. If you're not Black, the Great Migration still shaped your life. The music you listen to, the sports you watch, the cities you know, the very rhythm and vocabulary of American culture, all of it was influenced by this movement. The political map of America, the issues we still grapple with around race and inequality, the urban landscape of American cities, all of it connects back to this history. History isn't something that happened a long time ago to other people. History is the foundation we're all standing on right now. The choices people made, the systems they created, the movements they sparked. We're living in the world those things built. The Great Migration was one of those foundational events. 6 million people moved, and everything changed. Their story deserves to be remembered, understood, and taught, not as a footnote to other histories, but as a central chapter in the American story. because this isn't just black history. This is American history. And if we want to understand the America we live in today, its possibilities and its problems, its achievements and its failures, we need to understand the movement of people who said no more to oppression and headed north, looking for something better. They didn't find paradise, but they found opportunity. They found dignity. They found a chance to build something new. And what they built is still here, all around us, if we're willing to see it. That's the story of the Great Migration. 6 million people moved, and America was never the same.